So all of us have heard the saying that beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And I think after hearing this week's reading, it makes you wonder if we might also say that anger and fear, as well as wonder and joy, are in the eye of the beholder as well. There are different ways to read and understand this parable of the talents. But however we read or interpret this passage, I think it leads us to look at how we work through and apply steps 2 and 3 into our daily lives. So I want to spend a moment looking at the reaction that we read about and heard about with that third servant. His reaction and his motivation are based on fear. He, as himself confesses, is terrified of his master. He believes his master to be harsh, aggressive in his dealings. But we don't have any evidence at this point in the parable that the master is in fact this way. But the servant believes it, and he is afraid. And he freezes. And any of us who know that kind of sense of fear, we know what happens when we feel that and we freeze and we're unable to make any movement. He is scared, and when he freezes, he doesn't make a decision either way, because he's scared of the consequences that he will reap with whatever decision he makes. And we don't know anything about the feelings of the other servants, their feelings about the motivation behind their business dealings. We only know that they went out and multiplied what they'd been given. Did they do this because they loved their master, or did they also fear him, so they were driven to success at any cost, rather than that fear of failure? We just don't know. We only know that whatever it was that the third servant saw, that it so terrified him, but it did not have the same effect on the first two. They saw something different, and that changed everything. So think about how often this is true in our everyday life. What we expect is most often what we see. If we wake up in the morning determined that it's going to be an awful, horrible day, it most likely will be an awful day. If we set an intention to experience the good in the day, most likely that is what we will find throughout our day. Do we see conflict as something awful and avoid it at all costs? Then it probably will be. But instead, do we imagine conflict as a chance to grow and stretch? If so, we will probably experience it that way. If someone disagrees with us, do we see them as an opponent or a colleague? Again and again, our experience of life is so very deeply shaped by our expectations. What we expect of any given situation, event, or person very much determines our experience. And I have a hunch that that is the same is true of our expectations of God. I think each of us has a fairly clear, if often unspoken, expectations of God that shapes our experience with God profoundly. And I think each of us carries around with us a picture of God or an experience of God that rarely strays far from that picture we hold. For some, God is loving and kind. For others, God is stern and judgmental. Still others, they may see that God is protective. And others may see that God is always on the verge of anger. These pictures shape not just how we think about God, but how we actually experience so many events in our day-to-day life that we connect, often unconsciously, to God and to our life of faith. So what is your picture of God? And how does this picture of God influence your understanding that God, this power that is greater than you, can restore sanity back to your life? The basic text of Narcotics Anonymous offers this, that most of us have no trouble admitting that addiction had become a destructive force in our lives, and our best efforts resulted in ever greater destruction and despair. And at some point, we realized we needed the help of some power greater than our addiction. The only suggested guidelines are that this power be loving, caring, and greater than ourselves. The point is that we open our minds to believe. We may have difficulty with this, but by keeping an open mind, sooner or later, we find the help we need. If we imagine God primarily as an enforcer of rules and we get hung up in the legalism of a faith tradition, then how does that affect what it means to seek out God's will for our lives? If we visualize God as stern and prone to punishment, then we are apt to come to believe that everything bad in our lives, everything that we consider a struggle in our lives, is a punishment from God. And we end up seeing God as arbitrary and capricious. And that's what we end up experiencing. A fickle, unsympathetic, punishing God that ends up meeting those expectations. But on the other hand, when we view God in terms of grace, we are surprised and uplifted by the numerous gifts and the moments of grace that we experience all around us. And when we imagine God to be a God of love, we find it far easier to experience God's love in our own lives and then go on to share that with others. What you see is just what you get. And so perhaps this parable is inviting us to examine closely the picture of God we are carrying around inside us. Is God gracious and stern, loving or judgmental, or is God eager for peace? I do believe that the answer you find for yourself has a direct impact on how you understand living into the third step. Made a decision to turn our will and our lives over to the care of God as we understand God. Just like that servant who froze in fear, if we're holding on to a stern, judgmental, or angry picture of God, do we really trust God enough to turn our will and life over to the care of that God? Or do we freeze in fear? My hope for each one of us is that we take time while we are here on this journey into understanding our relationship with God and spending time really examining those pictures in our minds and the expectations that we've brought in about God. Because I do think that they lead us to this next question. Do we hold the notion that God exists for us rather than we exist for God? The notion that God exists to do for us what we want rather than our existing to seek out and do God's will in the world. Being able to seek out God's will for our lives helps us to begin to believe in ourselves again. Because when we rely on self-will and our own abilities, it can also lead us to have a very narrow vision of who and what God is in our lives. I think this story also helps bring into perspective that it's so easy to be hypnotized by the big things in life. Those things that we think will bring us happiness, or those things that we think will numb the pain. But God is forever calling our attention to the important little things. Faith the size of a mustard seed, a widow's mite as the most significant offering, strangers offering their phone numbers to a newcomer, sitting out on a bench and talking, sharing, being heard, and listening to someone else. All of this to remind us that the small and seemingly insignificant are loaded with possibilities. The 12 and 12 reminds us that step 3 calls for affirmative action, for it is only by action that we can cut away the self-will which has always blocked the entry of God or a higher power into our lives. And it requires willingness to build a trusting relationship with God. It involves taking risks, taking a leap of faith into following the suggestions of this program to live life differently. All of us make mistakes, and all of us have experienced a sense of failure of some sort. And just the fear of failure can sometimes paralyze us. The question for us about this parable and about this program is whether we really believe, and if we really can trust in this enough to risk living as the program is suggesting, as our higher power is directing us to live, rather than according to the demands of this disease, which will try to set itself up in God's place every time. This disease of addiction tries to enslave people to its own standards by telling them that their security is found in using. And this disease says that security is found in acquiring resources for ourselves, and isolating from those who are trying to help the most. So do you trust God enough? And will you trust in this fellowship enough to move dependence from this disease onto a dependence on God in this program that actually gives a sense of independence? As the 12 and 12 says, therefore, dependence, as AA practices it, is really a means of gaining true independence of the Spirit. And I believe we can. I believe each person in here can. Because when we can form a relationship with God that is based on love and grace, we can build a relationship that is trustworthy. We don't have to freeze in fear, and instead we can trust that it is safe to conform our will with God's will so we can begin to use it rightly. To all of us, this was the most wonderful revelation. Our whole trouble had been the misuse of willpower. We had tried to bombard our problems with it instead of attempting to bring it into agreement with God's intention for us. That also comes from the 12 and 12. This story tells us that the worst thing that can happen to us is not failure. The worst thing that can happen to us is that we make God out to be a horrible old grouch who rejects us. This story reminds us that the worst thing is not losing out, but never risking. We can learn from our failures, and we can come out stronger because it is in our failures and our struggles that we often learn our greatest lessons, and in turn can share that wisdom with someone else. Fear teaches us nothing until we are able to leave it behind. What turns out to be important is our decision to turn our will and our lives over to God's care and show our willingness to risk and trust God. May your vision of God be one that creates beauty in your life. And may your vision of God embolden you to bring beauty into the lives of others. Amen.